Welcome to Josh's Worst Nightmare Oddcast, presented by Denver Horror Collective. I'm your host, author Josh Schlossberg, author of Maline and the forthcoming Charwood. I'm now pitching my books in my intro, surveying the dark landscape of biological horror fiction. For this episode, we're being consumed by Rebecca Rowland. Rebecca Rowland is the dark fiction author of 2 fiction collections, 1 novel and a handful of novellas, and too many short stories. She is a curator of 7 horror anthologies, including the brand new that we're going to talk about on this episode, American Cannibal. Her speculative fiction, critical essays, and book reviews regularly appear in a variety of online and print venues. Rebecca co-owns and manages a small independent publishing house, gnawed Press. Welcome to my nightmare, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me, Josh. I've been a fan of this podcast for a long time, so this is super cool.
Great. Well, I have at least one fan. That's great to know. But yeah, so we've been in touch for a while. We've been communicating for a while on different stuff, and yeah, this new American Cannibal stuff, pretty exciting. Thought, of course, that's a perfect topic, and somehow have not covered cannibalism. So yeah, for folks who aren't aware, on Josh's Worst Nightmare, I invite on horror authors to talk about an aspect of biological horror, which I define broadly as living creatures and vital processes, somehow relevant to their writing, their projects. And yeah, so we're going to talk about cannibalism and related eating disorders, if we want to call it that. So tell us about American Cannibal and why you would create such a horrible thing as that.
Oh gosh, I mean, I was never a huge fan of sort of that trope, although I've definitely read more than my share over the past year. So it was just I was trying to think of a new theme for a new anthology, and this came up, and at first it seemed kind of bananas and bonkers, and then the more that I thought about it, the cooler it seemed, kind of tying it to American history and this idea of reinventing some of the things that have happened in the past, but adding in this kind of special seasoning, I guess, of cannibalism. So it came together 1,000 times better than I could have ever dreamt. And yeah, it's and I have to say that now I notice more and more shows, movies, things like that, that sort of feature cannibalism that are out there. I don't know if this is just I just happened to climb onto the wave at the right moment. But I'm a huge fan of Yellow Jackets. I don't know if you've seen the show on Showtime, but it's kind of like that show Lost, but with cannibalism in there, and it's fantastic. I think it's really the only show that I make sure that I watch. I'm not a huge TV person, but it's fascinating and gross, and yeah, I guess I'm into it.
That's very cool. Yeah, well, you said something that sort of sparked my imagination. Well, so I have some familiarity with cannibalism, not personally, but Denver Horror Collective put out something called Consumed: Tales Inspired by the Wendigo. So that was edited by Henry and Holly Snyder. And that was about the Wendigo. Well, basically stories based loosely around the Algonquin oral tradition of the Wendigo, which is kind of a creature living in the forest. And there are lots of cannibalistic themes tied into Wendigo. So there's definitely a long storied history in North America. I mean, of course, probably all around the world, but it seems like North America is often the place for that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about like the history of cannibalism or anything like that.
Well, I mean, first of all, I've read that anthology, by the way, because my writing partner, Michael Aloisi, has a story in there. And right. So I had picked it up, and I know that the intro was written by Al Going Back. Right. And he's kind of the authority on the Wendigo myth, right? And so what I do know about cannibalism, at least in America, before sort of doing more research on it, initially it was limited to the sort of Wendigo myth, right, that came from the Algonquin and the Cree tribes, but also just this, of course, everyone knows the story of the Donner Party, right? And sort of this idea of westward expansion and food is just not, we take it for granted, I think, today. We never have to resort to cannibalism, but if you're in a brand new country, brand new space, you don't have the resources, well, it's I guess you have to survive somehow. So those sort of things I was familiar with. Owl is definitely much more versed on the history and also
Sure.
the myths that are associated. Yeah.
Yeah, well, one that comes to mind is also Alfred Packer. So that's in Colorado where I'm living. And the South Park guys did a musical about it, as absurd as that seems. It was pretty
Yeah.
amusing. So it's been in the zeitgeist and it's happened. Of course, in what was that, the 90s, the movie Alive
Correct.
of the
Yeah. The soccer players,
in the
right?
Andes, I think it was, right, in South America or
Correct.
something. They crashed
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they ate each other's butts or something like that.
I
And
mean, technically, the people were already dead. I feel like it's not. I
that's
guess I feel like if there's so many different levels of cannibalism. There's like okay, well, we're all starving and we're going to wait to see who falls asleep first. And I guess you're going to be dinner if it's you. And then it's we're in this tragedy. These people have been dead. They've been lying there, for days and days and days. And essentially they're meat. It's really difficult for me to sort of rationalize that as a vegetarian. I mean, it's a couple of steps that I really have to take, but I get it. You got to do what you're going to do. I get it. I get it.
well, that's really interesting that as a vegetarian, you chose to put this together. I guess you have more of a natural, and somebody who has been vegetarian. I'm currently not, but I was vegetarian for 20 years. I was vegan
Oh,
for a little bit too. And I do limit my meat intake for sure. And so there is something just ghastly about consuming flesh. I mean, one can argue there's a natural element to it. There's some unnatural elements these days, for sure. But so you're somebody who just the flesh taste and the flesh idea is probably more loathsome than to others. So that would sort of lend you naturally to this sort of endeavor.
I think so. I think that the whole idea, I mean, I'm not a vegetarian for health reasons. I got to be,
Mhm.
I mean, that's I don't think about that at all. It's more of just all my life, I've never liked the consistency of meat. Even when I was really little, um, my parents would be horrified because they would, cook a steak and I would just drown it in ketchup. I could not, I wanted to get the taste out of my mouth. So the idea of human flesh, I guess I just, maybe on the flip side, is I don't really see it as being that different than
Mm.
consuming a cow or a chicken or anything else that's sort of breathing at one point.
Yeah, well, I think they call it long pig. I think is I don't know if
Yes.
you've heard that
Yeah.
term. That's
Yeah.
I forget where that comes from, but that's a euphemism for eating humans.
Yeah, and so I've visited a cadaver lab a few years ago, and I have to say, I know that everyone says that human flesh is very similar to pig flesh, but I would equate it to chicken, having seen them dissect some of the cadaver bodies and seeing how they sort of came apart and the consistency of the layers and things. It looked a lot, for me, it looked a lot like dark meat chicken to me. So I'm just going to put that out there for maybe
Interesting.
the
For
chicken
our
fan.
remaining 3 listeners at this point. But yeah, no, that's I mean, that's the heart of biological horror. It's like accepting our connection to the earthly plane and flesh and all that stuff. So no, that is actually really interesting to me. And I think as a horror writer, horror authors and editors, we need to know this stuff. So that's good. And yeah, no, I think it's really not that different eating a human. We're not obviously advocating for cannibalism here, but there are gray areas. And I think it's a spectrum like a lot of things. And yes, I will state on this podcast that I more strongly disapprove of eating humans than I do of animals. But, as an environmentalist and environmental organizer for a long time, there's a lot of environmental benefits to that. But I don't want to go into that too much more. But you brought up an interesting thing, the idea of a predatory cannibal versus a scavenger cannibal.
Right.
So like if you murder somebody to eat them, bad. If you're like, hey, I haven't been snacking for a while and there's a dead person, cool, in your opinion.
I think they're very, very different realms. And I actually think that that's why we find cannibalism so frightening, is because, with every other type of horror, there is us and then there is the other, whether it's something supernatural, a ghost, a demon, whatever, or if it's even the other being a serial killer, someone that we find has decided to leave our group, right, as our agreed upon rules. But with cannibalism, it becomes this, there is no sort of line, it's like you and I go camping, Josh, and we get lost, and it's weeks and weeks and weeks, and all of a sudden I'm no longer afraid of bears. Now I'm afraid because I know that you are starving. Yeah. and we have sharp weapons. That's it. It just becomes, I think it's a different level of fear, because it's we can no longer say, oh, it's I can escape this, or this is something I can close my eyes and it won't be there anymore. I mean, we live among each other, and who knows, who could turn on you next.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, people murder people all the time, and they do it to get stuff or for their own benefit or resources. But this is the most primal form. This is, I would almost say, the least selfish form of murder. Why am I saying this? But I'm hungry, I'm about to die, it's you or me, so that is a really frightening kind of thing, versus like, I'm jealous of you, or I think you're an ass and I'm going to, kill you now. Those are less likely. Let's put it this way. I think fewer people would succumb to that, but what percentage of people would actually succumb to, I'm starving and I need to eat? So that might be part of the primordial fear involved with the whole thing.
Right. And then there's also, just looking at literature, I just finished a book that was written in the mid 80s by Eric Higgs. It's called The Happy Man. And it's sort of this bizarre, it feels very kind of yuppie, just lifestyle kind of story, where these new neighbors move in, and the narrator's talking about how, oh, they're really interesting, and they kind of have these weird wild parties, and the debauchery kind of starts to escalate. And then at one point he finds out, I mean, they like to push the envelope, they like to just push, and once they've sort of overcome something, they want more. And so they've actually now graduated to seducing people and then eating them. So they've actually gone to a different level. They're not starving at all, they're very well off. Mm-hmm. It's just they're bored. And I think that, I think Higgs probably wrote it as a commentary on the 1980s excess, maybe. Sure. But it's still sort of this frightening, maybe you're not starving, but maybe you're really jonesing for I don't know, something new. And now I'm, dinner sort of. Yeah.
Well, I do want to get into the symbolism of that more in a second, but a couple other things I think worth mentioning. Of course, we have to mention Silence of the Lambs, right? Yes, Hannibal the Cannibal. Yes. The book by Thomas Harris, which I actually have not read. I've only seen the film, but I would say, so far as cannibals in fiction or literature, that probably looms the largest, would you say? At least in the US.
Absolutely. He's the touchstone, I think, for American Cannibal right there. But I mean, so many new pieces have come on the scene. I know that Alma Katsu did the piece The Hunger, which was essentially about westward expansion, but she, rather than explaining it the way that we know it as through the history books. She takes a completely different direction with it, which I thought was really smart. And then we have the splatter writers, like Rath, James White. We're talking about, these serial killers or people that are doing it just for pleasure. But yeah, absolutely. Thomas Harris he's the where we'd start for sure. For sure.
Yeah, Rath James White actually has a story in Consumed Tales Inspired by the Wendigo also. So yeah, the splatter world. Yeah, so there's like the gross out aspect of it, of course, but then there is a symbolic thing. But before getting into that, just to cover a little more of the bio horror stuff. So since you're, I would say, a connoisseur of this, what would you say is the best part of the human to eat? Like, this is unfortunate. They're dead.
Mhm.
You're hungry.
Yep.
You don't feel like walking out, whatever. You need to eat, right? So where do you go first? Just for to make this practical
Yeah.
podcast for people.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we have to go for the thigh, right? Because it's got the most amount of meat. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of gnawing on bones, so I would probably avoid the arms and the fingers. And you're exerting a lot of energy for very little payoff, I feel like, in those areas. So yeah, I would say the thigh. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean the thigh and the buttocks probably. Now, just so folks getting any idea, so I'm like pretty lean and rangy, so I'm not good eating. So don't even consider me. But yeah, I would say that's probably what you want to do. And that is that thing. You start thinking of humans as the way we do just very casually with animals, and you realize how quickly that slippery slope of grisliness can get, right? Because we have chops, we have I've seen things where it's kind of like, whatever, you break down the ribs, the hock, the different parts of the animal, and then you could do it for a human. Like, we don't typically say that, like, nice hocks, right? But it's all the same, and we're the same flesh. I mean, again, I'm not trying to make this a moral thing, but the reality is, we are all animals, and I think that's kind of the horror of this. It's the reminder that we are animals too, and there's a brutality to us. I mean, even vegetarianism, I'd be the first to say, as an environmentalist, there's still great impacts on the natural world and habitat for animals and killing of pests. So there's no purity in this world. There's just none. But there are definitely scales, I would say, of impact, and not eating meat is way less impactful. No question about that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so what else do you think? Because what we're doing is we're getting this new trend, like you say, of cannibalism. So the Jeffrey Dahmer film that came out lately. And so what do you think it might be behind that?
I mean, I am curious to know, because if you look at trends in horror, they often do kind of run alongside whatever's going on politically in the world. I mean, if you look at, we have this sort of rise in the faceless slasher, right, in the late 70s, early 80s. And what is that about? Is that sort of late Cold War fear? Like, what, we have the 90s, we have this sort of new wave of horror coming out. And is that, after 9/11? And also, I think, with all of the social movements, right, that have sort of risen in the last 20 years, we have a very different type of horror that's coming out. And I think that's a product of what's going on in the world. Cannibalism, I don't know. I don't know if we're maybe, I mean, if I were to stretch, maybe metaphorically, we feel like we are turning on each other, especially in a time of, post-pandemic. And we also have this social media that is just full of, I hate to say, vitriol and just these sort of mass bullying and that goes on there. Are we kind of cannibalizing ourselves? And this is how we're getting out the anxiety through art? I don't know, but it's possible. I mean, there's definitely a reason. There's a method to the madness, I think, with trends in horror. I'm just not quite sure what it is.
Yeah, it's funny because I hadn't thought a lot about this, but I just wrote down in my notes just a few minutes ago, pretty much exactly what you just said. So like, I wonder if it's symbolic, and a lot of this stuff is unconscious, of course, right? And maybe it's just arbitrary too, but eating one another. So destroying that which is the other, and that can be, we often think of kind of like historical oppression for sure, but it can occur in lots of different formats as we see on social media. But it's like making people the other, making them lesser, making them subhuman. So why not just consume them? Why not just, and what is consumption? And I'm just spitballing, make this up as I'm going along here. So not only, it's not just killing them, right? That's one thing. Like, yes, we hate the other, we destroy them. This is like taking what they are into you to nourish yourself. So I don't know what the hell that would refer to, but.
Or taking a piece of the other person, destroying them, and then essentially owning it, right? And now it becomes part of your own cells, really, because it's going to build your own body. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly there are cultures and religions that use this sort of idea of eating flesh and blood from other people as part of like a sacrament. What is that about? I don't know. I don't know if it's a power dynamic. I don't know if it's a way to kind of share and make a connection. But it's definitely going to be, if it's something with horror, it's going to be something a little more insidious, I think, for sure.
It's funny, you mentioned something that I also just wrote down in the notes. But first, yeah, it's not a good idea to eat other people, and nature has made punishments for it. So mad cow disease likely came from feeding cows to cows. So these prions, which are frankly one of the most horrifying things I can think of, they don't even know if they're alive. They're not even like viruses. They're just like these fucking things, and they act like they're alive. And so that's what mad cow disease is. And there's something called Jakob Creutzfeldt, which is the human version of that. And you can get that from, like, some cannibal societies have gotten that from eating one another. And in those societies, it is a power thing. It's like, I'm going to take the power of that person into me. But you mentioned, I think you might even literally even use this term, because this is the term I wrote down before you said it too. So we're on the same wavelength. Intimate. It's like the most intimate act. I mean, it's not like sexual. Like sexual could be, bringing things into you or going into somebody else. There's a weird thing of that. Like, it's the closest you can get to another person.
Right. And once again, listeners, we're not advocating for.
Actually, I've changed my mind. I am now officially advocating for.
I'm on the fence. I got to say, I'm on the fence. No, yeah, for sure. It's definitely the most intimate thing I think that you could do, is to consume another person. Yeah. And symbolically, it is sort of like another level of sexual content. I mean, I think that's, like I had mentioned with the Higgs book. I mean, that was sort of their next level. They were already having these sort of key parties. They were bringing all these strangers into their homes, and that wasn't enough for them. And they decided, well, no, this is the next level, so it was sort of beyond sex.
Right. Yeah. And the dangerous game, the most ultimate prize. There's some short story I read a long time ago that it was about these, I forget what the term is, but like the food aficionados, and they get more and more bored. So of course they have to lead eventually towards eating parts of human stuff.
Right.
Natural progression of stuff. But unless you have more to say about cannibalism, I thought maybe we could go into Taika, which I don't know much about.
Yes, because I have a novella coming out just in a couple of weeks, actually, less than 2 weeks from today. It's in a charity anthology that Holly Ray Garcia put together to benefit Texas food banks. And my novella is titled Rock of Ages, and it's in the collection Table for Three, which will be out. 100% of the proceeds go to food banks. So please keep that in mind. But mine, it starts with the narrator talking about her stepmother who consumes rocks. Literally, like it starts off with just a couple of pebbles, and then it progresses almost to like a bizarro level where she's going around the neighborhood and just taking landscaping rocks from various people's yards and eating them. Her husband is completely clueless, doesn't understand why they're having all of these issues with their plumbing, because she's just consuming rock after rock after rock. He's trying to unplug the toilet, which has now been stopped up for obvious reasons. And, she's in the other room kind of scooping the gravel out of the fish aquarium and consuming that. And it's just, I have it set up so that, she has this form of pica, which I find to be a really fascinating disorder, because so pica is any consumption of something that's not food, this compulsion to eat things like clay or rocks or paper or hair, where it's just you just need to do it, and it often causes some real biological issues. Obviously, if you're putting things in your body that your body can't break down or can be dangerous. In some cases, it can be caused by like a mineral deficiency, right? If someone is in need of iron, the body is driving them to kind of seek out that mineral in places that aren't food. But other times it's a psychological cause, and they're not quite sure what is pushing the person to do that. So I just find it fascinating in that morbid sense of, there but by the grace of God go I, that I'm not outside kind of digging in my backyard to find something to eat that's not food. But yes, so that's in table for three. And what do you know about pica? What have you heard? And
Very little. I mean,
yeah.
First thing I thought of is pica, which is like a mountain rodent. It's like a marmot little thing is a pica, but that's different. So, but yeah, I have heard of things where people will eat the stuffing of sofas, like just
Yeah.
pull that out. And I mean, I
Yeah.
guess I can see some odd appeal. I mean, clearly I'm not susceptible to that stuff, but texturally. But my thoughts on this, just based on knowing nothing, is that I like to go, even though I'm whatever, I write biological horror. That's just sort of like a niche I put myself into. But I do think all the time about the symbolic allegory aspect. And that's probably actually drives my writing a lot more. I'll see a biological thing, and I'm like, okay, what is the meaning of this? Or something that is an issue. And then I'm like, all right, how does this tie into like physical biology? But so in my mind, I think about how eating these days for pretty much all of us has become almost separate from nutrition. A lot of times, like you used to eat, it was fuel to keep you going. Now, I mean, we do it as an addiction. We do it to relieve anxiety, boredom, just for taste stuff, and it's never enough. So it would seem like the natural progression from eating Cheetos would be sofa stuffing. You might as well.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if the sofa is salty enough, I don't know, I guess. Because what you're saying makes sense, because you're eating Cheetos. What exactly are you getting out of that? You're maybe some simple sugars that you could break down,
Right.
if you want to go for a quick sprint. I don't know, but otherwise it's just junk. It's the same really as eating your sofa. And once again, listeners, we're not advocating that you eat your sofa either, or your neighbor. But what you're saying makes sense. I guess maybe it's not as bizarre as I think it is, because especially as Americans, we're awful in what we put in our bodies, and with fast food, and I could just go on and on with that, because as someone that my day job is as I teach in an urban high school, and I'm always talking to my kids, about, don't eat fast food. Don't eat it. I get it that it's quote fast. I get that it's easy. But your body, it's the most precious thing that you'll ever own. right, in your life. And so take care of it. Don't put this kind of junk into it. Don't drink all of this sugar. It's just, so I get it. Yeah. And I guess maybe I should add, and don't don't eat your couch stuffing either, I guess.
No, but if you do, we're not going to judge you. But well, something I just looked up here, and the first thing that did occur to me was pregnancy. There's that craving, oh, pickles and ice cream or whatever the hell, and that's probably nutrient deficiency or just who knows what. But apparently it is more common with people who are pregnant. So that's interesting.
Right. Yeah, because especially if they, because now your body is supporting an additional life force, right? And that being is going to need the nutrition that maybe already you're not getting enough for your own body. And now it's either they're going to siphon it from your body, your bones, which I know does happen with some things like calcium and so forth. But you have to find it somewhere. And maybe if the body just goes into maybe panic mode and just says, look, this mineral is here, and it's in this clay that's outside your house, and that's the fastest way. And so, maybe it just drives the woman to do that, which is frightening. It's definitely frightening. But yeah, but as far as why it affects people who are not pregnant, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, the pregnancy thing. So the thought that occurred to my horror writer mind is, so pregnancy is a kind of cannibalism, like for a little while at least. I mean, people liken it to parasites, and obviously I'm not against babies, but if you're going to go in that direction. So it's cannibalizing the mother to a little bit, to a certain degree. It's happening.
Absolutely.
They're using the nutrients, no question. So my thought is that then the mother is like, well, normal food is not enough. This thing is eating me alive. And so like, I better toss some rocks in there. I don't know. Or maybe who knows what's going on with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, for non-pregnant, I mean, I wonder if it is the mouth sensations. I mean, there's certainly not much with the nutrition. It's the texture. We are very textural. And the reason why potato chips are so popular is because of the air bubbles that make all the explosions. And of course there is taste, but yeah, the taste. So we think of sugar, salt, fat, but that ain't what's going on with pica, because that stuff probably all tastes like shit. So
right.
And we don't have to talk about that particular topic, but yeah, so it's got to be the texture. It's got to be textural, right?
Or if it's just, maybe it's this, even just looking at eating disorders like overeating or bulimia, and this sort of this compulsion to fill up this hole, right? Whatever it is inside, by stuffing it full of food, and in this whole idea of just consuming. And it's not even about the texture anymore. It's just about getting it inside. And so maybe pica is part of that as well, but maybe it's more focused than an overeating disorder or a bulimia. Yeah, I don't know. It's funny because when I did do some background research on pica, it's not classified as an eating disorder per se, okay, right? So we have these eating disorders, and they're very much psychological. They're very much like a psychosomatic sort of disorder, whereas pica, I don't think that they're quite sure what's going on besides that sort of mineral deficiency that happens in some cases. In other cases, it's people are consuming, hair. There is a very specific type of pica where people who will pull out their own hair and consume that, and that that has nothing to do with mineral deficiency or anything like that your body's craving. So it's interesting to think about and sort of try to figure out what's going on there.
Right. Well, it seems to be a uniquely human thing, because when animals do it, I mean, there are animals that eat rocks, but they do it for ballast, or there's usually a reason, right? And I think certain chickens, they'll eat rocks because it helps with digestion and the gizzard or something. But we humans, is it just we humans we're such a complex machinery in our brain that it's just going to go off in a bunch of directions, and there's not always a practical reason behind it, right? I mean, we don't want to, what's the word, stigmatize people who have illnesses and disorders, but it's probably safe to say it's not a healthy thing to eat non-food items. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Well, a lot of these disorders, what happens is they end up with bowel blockages, right?
Yeah.
So even the hair, I know that reading about how that's often when it's discovered, when all of a sudden just the hair is just built up in the small intestine because it's not broken down in the stomach. It just continues to go through, and now it's this blockage, and it causes all sorts of horrible side effects there. And I obviously with things like rocks, which are definitely not, they're definitely going to be blocking things. So yeah. It's interesting. I mean, you even think about, I don't have children of my own, but I have friends that have kids where the kids swallowed various things, and there's always these warnings like don't leave this around a child under the age of 2. And then you wonder, is it that they just want to put it in their mouth and it accidentally goes down their throat, or is it like no, I'm going to eat this, and why
Right.
is that?
That's a good point, right? Yeah, so that is currently, it happens all the time in little kids, and sometimes it's colorful things, certainly colorful things, but I mean, a GI Joe arm doesn't look like food. So yeah, what is going on with there? So yeah, maybe there is something deeper that we haven't figured out yet. Science hasn't figured out yet. But I think of the rock biter from the Neverending Story. Maybe that's what kicked it all off. I don't know, because it does look good. Like, just for folks who don't know the Neverending Story, but there's this great big creature, and it literally just eats rocks, and they look kind of palatable. Like, it would go around and be like, oh, there's some fine quartz over here. But yeah, the bowel blockages. Maybe I can have you come back and we could talk another time about bowel blockages for the whole episode. But we should probably wrap it up here. But before we go, it's been great to have you. But what are you working on now, and where can people find your work?
Oh my goodness. Well, I have a couple of short stories that I'm working on for different anthologies that are dropping everywhere from fall all the way to next spring that I'm really excited about working on. Cable for 3 comes out in 2 weeks on June 2nd, and my short story collection from Dead Sky is coming out in October. And all of those links, all that information, people can find me on rowlandbooks.com, just ROWLAND books.com. And so all of my stuff is there. I'm also going to be at a few conventions here and there. I'll be at the Texas AuthorCon in July. I'll be at TerrorCon and the Connecticut Horror Fest in September. So certainly, if you're in the area, come by, say hello.
Great. Well, it's been really great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks for taking a trip with me through Josh's Worst Nightmare, where I, Josh Schlossberg, survey the dark landscape of biological horror fiction presented by Denver Horror Collective. If you don't want to miss any of the great, and sometimes disturbing, weekly episodes I've got planned for you, be sure to subscribe to Josh's Worst Nightmare on a variety of podcast platforms. You can also sign up for Josh's Worst Nightmare e-newsletter at joshsworstnightmare.com, where I share a whole squirming mess of bio-horror, including my infamous haiku horror reviews and my latest dark scribblings. Speaking of which, if you haven't already picked up a copy of my cosmic biological folk horror novella, Maline, from D&T Publishing, you can find a copy of the paperback, hardcover, or ebook at Amazon, godless.com, or joshsworstnightmare.com. Yours darkly, Josh Schlossberg.